Welcome to Module 2, Women Who Lived with Purpose. Notice the way I phrase this. Women who lived with purpose, not with a purpose. None of these women really lived with a singular goal in mind. They had larger purposes to serve society. That's what we'll discover in this module. Many of these women were publishers, activists, authors, artists, politicians, Nobel laureates, but each had a role to play, and they lived it well and with fullness in America's 20th century. The first we'll explore is Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson was from Pennsylvania. She earned her master's degree in zoology from the Johns Hopkins University in 1932. She spent 15 years in federal service, rising to be editor-in-chief for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. During this time, she demonstrated her gifts as a writer, as a zoologist, and in her book, The Silent Spring, as well as The Sea Around Us, another of her books, she really created the modern ecological movement. She gave us to understand that everything in nature was connected. Now, The Silent Spring was one of those books that was assigned to us in high school to read for our summer reading list. And it was one of the books that most of the young boys at Vianney High School actually read. It was a remarkable story. And the title comes from this. She was on a crusade against DDT, the terrible herbicide that killed pests and it killed plants. And it was thought in general science that it would gradually dissipate. But what in fact happened is it would get into the grass, into the food supply, into animals, and it would actually become concentrated in their internal organs. For example, the reproductive organs of birds. And she opined with good scientific reasoning that if this DDT had the effect it was likely to have on birds, their shells would not be sufficient to house the little hatchlings, the chicks, and in fact we would end up with the Silent Spring. It was a modern, marvelous work that eventually convinced the Congress that we should ban DDT. She really was the founder of the modern ecology movement and sort of the grandmother of the climate global change that we see now in nature. Rosa Parks is a story that you're all familiar with. The thing that you may not remember is the Montgomery bus boycott lasted more than a year. It was 381 days. Rosa Parks was an activist before she refused to move to the back of the bus in Montgomery. But it was her symbolic leadership, her conviction that demonstrated that ordinary people could bring about extraordinary change. Rosa Parks. Now this is a woman whose obituary I cut out of the Chicago Tribune back some years ago in 1998. You can read the clipping for yourself. This remarkable woman lived her life in care of foster children. She cared for more than 170 foster children, most of them with Down syndrome. At the same time, she raised her own 4 children. She always had her little bungalow in Chicago, out in Oak Lawn, not far from where we lived, that was full of babies and small children needing changes and feeding. And she was just a generous spirit. Now, this is not a famous woman in history, but it's a woman whose life we should emulate because she lived with purpose. Ada Rose Walters. Now here's a picture of Ethel Kennedy and a picture of Eleanor Roosevelt. Ethel Kennedy had 11 children with her husband, Senator Bobby Kennedy. Eleanor Roosevelt had 6 children. These women were successful at being mothers and being cultural forces as well. Amelia Earhart had no children, but she was still a remarkable woman of achievement. Eleanor Roosevelt, as the wife of the president, had a daily column. It was simply called My Day, and it was syndicated in hundreds of newspapers. And we'll get to the story of Marian Anderson in a minute, and you'll find out why Eleanor Roosevelt was famous in the civil rights cause as well. Dorothy Day is someone about whom you all should read more and learn more about the life of this remarkable woman. She was a straightforward woman who understood and saw social ills and gradually came to conversion as a Catholic. And she, on March 1st of 1933, founded the Catholic Worker Movement. It was not a hierarchical kind of organization. It was, much as she lived, a simple life that sought to care for others. I've recently read this wonderful book by her youngest grandchild, Kate Hennessy. I really recommend it to you. Dorothy Day. It's a life that you should know more about. Now, this is a woman I know that you haven't heard about. Her name is Mary Lasker. Mary Lasker was rather wealthy thanks to the success that her ad executive husband, Albert, had. But Mary Lasker was a woman who understood that with these gifts she had, there were crusades out there. And one of her crusades was to help create the National Cancer Institute, to get the United States government to fund basic research, applied research, clinical research, so that we might know more and more about how to treat cancer. I dare say that every one of you in this class probably has someone in your family who has been stricken by cancer, and many of whom have probably survived it. It is thanks to Mary Lasker and thanks to her generosity, her philanthropy, but her single-mindedness of purpose, knowing that only the federal government had enough leverage and enough money to give to this great crusade. Mary Lasker, the mother of the National Cancer Institute. I will, for the life of me, never understand the courage and the brilliance and the determination of Helen Keller, a young girl who fought through blindness and deafness, learned to speak with the great help of her teacher, Annie Sullivan, graduated from college, and became a great author and force in America and in the world, both by her example and by her message. You need to know more about that uncommon woman, Helen Keller. Now, Jeannette Rankin is by far one of my favorites because she's a political person. Jeannette Rankin was the first woman elected to the United States Congress, and she was elected in November of 1916. Now, does that strike you at all? It should, because the Constitution was not amended to give women the right to vote until 1920. But, you see, women had been voting in territorial elections and in state elections since 1895 in America. Frankly, back in colonial America, women had the right to vote, but later it was taken away. So Jeannette Rankin, a Republican from Montana, was elected to the House. And it was, of course, in March of 1917 that she came into the House of Representatives. And Jeannette Rankin, true to her beliefs, was a determined, dedicated pacifist. And it was not long after she was there that she was called upon to vote on whether the United States should enter World War I, as we called it then, Europe's war. She voted no. She was, at that time, one of 50 members of the House of Representatives who voted no. It was a very difficult vote for her, and she was not reelected. However, she decided to come back, and in 1940, she was once again elected to the House of Representatives from Montana. And, as fate would have it, she was called upon once again in December of 1917 to vote on whether America should enter what became World War II. Jeannette Rankin, true to her beliefs, voted no. This time, she was the only American to vote no. Her vote no against American declaration of war against Germany made her so upset, made her the subject of such attacks and ridicule that she went into the cloakroom there, had an apple, sat down alone, and then in sequence, the House was going to vote on declarations of war against Germany, against Japan, and all the others. I'm sorry, she voted against the war against Japan first. That was the first vote. And she was called back to vote in again in the other declarations of war, and she voted present. Again, she lost her seat. But she lived and died a pacifist. In 1972, when she was a very old woman living out in California, she did consider running for the United States Senate, which she did not. This is a woman about whom you should know more. As it turned out, when she died, she lived in Carmel by the Sea, out there in California, and her ashes were scattered, quite fittingly, in the Pacific Ocean. Now, this is one of my very favorite stories of women in the 20th century, Edith Galt Wilson. President Wilson was a widower who romanced and eventually married Edith Galt. She was the widow of a prominent jeweler in Washington, D.C. And Wilson, despite his apparent looks, was quite a romantic. He wrote her great letters. He was the first president to drive. He used to take her out on motor car rides on Sunday afternoons, and eventually they married. Well, as he was coming back from the Great Peace Conference and the attempt he was making to create the League of Nations in Europe, he was stricken by a stroke. He was taken upstairs to the residence of the White House. His physician, Dr. Grayson, attended him. So too did the White House butler and Mrs. Wilson. America knew the president was sick, but we didn't know how sick. We didn't know that he was paralyzed and unable to speak. We didn't know at the time that he was unable to write or move. Gradually he did gain those powers again on a limited basis. But for months and months, Edith Galt Wilson would go to the cabinet, would go downstairs, would take papers upstairs to the residence to have the president sign them. The president wasn't able to speak. He wasn't able to move his hands. He probably wasn't able to reason clearly. And so America had, in these times, arguably our first female president, Edith Galt Wilson. She referred to this period of her life as the stewardship, she called it. It is a remarkable story. It was not long ago that Dr. Grayson's grandson donated the papers of his grandfather to a museum they have in Stanton, Virginia, which is Wilson's birthplace. And these medical records include all of the details about the president's condition. I'm sure there are lots of scholars who are writing papers right now, but the real story belongs to Edith Galt Wilson. I want to just mention these three women briefly. Frances Perkins was back at the time of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, the Commissioner of Labor in the state of New York, and she was in downtown Manhattan and got to the site of the terrible tragedy not long after it had begun, and she saw the women literally on the ground having jumped from the floors above to their deaths. She later went on to become, under Franklin Roosevelt, the first female member, the Secretary of Labor in the United States, first female member of the cabinet. Sandra Day O'Connor, of course, was the first female justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, appointed by Ronald Reagan. The interesting thing about Sandra Day O'Connor is she graduated third in her class at Stanford University Law School. First in her class was a young man who tried to court her for a while, a guy named William Rehnquist, who eventually became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, in which she served. She went around in 1951 looking for jobs, and the only job she was offered in any law firm in California to which she applied was that as a legal secretary. Of course, Sandra Day O'Connor later became a very distinguished justice. And of course, Jackie Kennedy lived with such elegance, and she was a woman who lived with purpose, purpose of culture, purpose of family, and purpose of devotion to the nation.